Good evening. I hope your day went really well. I had a pretty exciting day. I got a chance to go to the computer store in Fairfax with one of our elders, help him pick out a computer. So it was good to have a little bit of fellowship. We kept our distance as best we could, but it was good to have a little bit of fellowship. Good to be able to just get caught up on things in person. And I got a pretty important letter today. I got a letter in the mail. This is it right here. This is from the Ohio Department of Health. I had petitioned them for my original pre-adoption birth certificate, and I think it's in that envelope. So a lot of mystery around who my dad was, my birth father. I never struggled with adoption the way some people were on odysseys to find their birth parents. I never really had that. I had fantastic parents. They treated me well. They were my mom and dad. A little bit later in life, 10 years or so, I've been contacted by people that claim to be first and second cousins and that sort of thing. And it's gotten kind of interesting. And it kind of led me to start looking into the background. Bill and Kat Schwetke did some genealogies for me and tried to find out what was happening. But what's missing is who my mother and father were. So Kelly and I are probably going to open this envelope later on tonight and see if there's an answer to that question. I'm a little bit excited about it. Not really going to change anything. Just met with the elders online, and I said, finally, I'll have proof that I was born. But that's about it. So I was talking to somebody else today, and they told me that they're glad that things are beginning to lighten up some because they felt like they were in prison for all this time. And so a few people have asked me where I get my ideas for these devotions. And a lot of them are just things that I like to talk about. So some of them come out of my daily reading of the Bible. So I'll hit a verse or two that will strike me, and I'll think, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, and I'll make a note. And some of them come from, I read 2 daily devotions in the morning. I would never take somebody else's devotion, but from time to time, there's a verse that one of those devotions is based on that strikes me maybe a little bit differently, and I'll talk about that. So my prayer is that the Lord will lead me to the devotions that we all need to hear, and that I'll take a step forward, and that maybe you'll have an opportunity to take a step forward with me. So today the idea came from that comment that was made that a friend of mine said that he feels like he's been in prison during all this time. And it made me think about Philippians. And what did Paul do when he was in prison? How did he handle these situations? So in celebration of my envelope, I have some 5-year Pu'er here. It's a rare tea. I don't drink it very often because it's rare and a little stiff as far as the expense is concerned. But I'm celebrating today. I'm celebrating tonight. And so I thought I'd break out some of the 5-year Pu'er. Very earthy tea, very dark tea. And it really is an acquired taste. So get yourself something and join me. And once you've settled in, turn to the book of Philippians. Book of Philippians, we'll be looking at chapter 1. And I want to read verses 12 through 14, but then we'll talk about what comes after 12 through 14. Now, this is Paul, and he says, and he's in prison in Rome, probably around 60 AD, not the last time he's in prison, but Paul can see what's coming, and, everywhere he goes, he gets thrown in prison, and eventually he knows there's going to be real trouble for him being there. So he says, and he writes to the Philippians, and the great thing about the letter of Philippians, I love it, because Paul is so thankful. Paul is just bubbling over with gratitude and thanks and joy at what is happening in the Philippian church, and, he kind of had the same feelings about the church in Ephesus. So he writes them from this Roman jail. Now, Roman jails were just terrible places to be. They were dark, they were wet, They were filthy. There were rats all over the place. Everybody's chained to walls. The food is terrible, largely inedible. Water's contaminated. It's just an awful place to be. And so here's what Paul says from that environment. Verse 12, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard. Paul's in prison witnessing to the Roman guards and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So Paul says, yeah, I'm in prison. It's a rotten place, but my imprisonment is for Christ. And really what's happening is other people are getting bolder in sharing the gospel. Then he says this in verse 15. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry. Ooh, bad. But others from goodwill. Ooh, good. And so you think Paul's going to launch into this. Let me tell you about these guys that are envious and in rivalry with each other. But this is what he says in verse 16. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. That's a whole other lesson we could talk about sometime. And so Paul says in verse 18, what then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Paul is rejoicing over both of them. He said, and later on we'll find out that these people that are doing this out of envy and rivalry will pay for that, but they're preaching Christ. And the ones who are doing out of goodwill will be rewarded for that, but they're preaching Christ. And what I want you to think about while we continue to deal with this situation that we're in is that Paul is in this absolutely dreadful place as he writes this stuff. And he's saying, yeah, it's dreadful. Oh, yeah, I don't like it. No, I'd rather be somewhere else. But I'm doing this for the sake of Christ. I'm doing it for the sake of the gospel. And because I'm here, and maybe because of the way he's writing these things, other people are preaching the gospel as well. So Paul just has this incredible capability to be content wherever he is and put his eyes on Christ. Now, it's not Paul just smacking a smiley face on things. It's Paul making Christ first in his life. It's Paul making the gospel his highest priority. And that's why he's content, because he knows he has an eternal place in heaven with his Father, with Christ, and that whatever he's going through here is temporary. So this allows Paul to suffer through a Roman prison. And while he's there, take advantage of the situation and preach to the guards. Preach to whoever's in prison with him there. And people hear about that and begin talking about it. And it affects them. And they become bolder. And they talk about it. So that's what I want for my walk, for this time, where we're restricted as to what we can do. I want to be bold enough to speak to Christ about people. I want to know that all the people around me feel like they're in prison too. And that we can tell them that there's really even freedom available to them, even though they feel restricted, because they can have a relationship with Christ like we do. I hope that encourages you at the end of the day. I pray that you rest easy tonight. I pray that you feel the presence and the power of the Holy Spirit and the peace that goes beyond understanding. I love you. I miss you. I'll see you in the morning.